Welcome to episode 23 of Raiders the Lost Art. My name is Finbar and this is Secrets of the Brand Professor featuring Adrian Elton. Do you know what a brand is? Do you know what the value of a brand is? Do you know how to build a brand? Well, today we're going to uncover some of those secrets. Today we've got Adrian Elton. Adrian is one of Australia's top creative minds, but he works all over the world on really diverse projects, from working with Sesame Street to Disney to the TV series Preacher to art directing documentaries. He's a really fascinating cat. And, we sat down and had a chat about how do you uncover the value in a brand? How do you build a brand? How do you create cut through in today's avalanche of content? So we had a great conversation. And with that, I'm going to leave it there and take you into the journey. Hit it. So Adrian, it's so great to have you on the show, mate. Thank you so much for joining. I can't wait to hear all about brands and the value and all that sort of stuff. So I couldn't have picked anyone better to actually explain it to us all.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to shedding light and hopefully dispelling a few myths and giving you my take on how we can take brands from bland to molto grande.
Oh, perfect. Oh, couldn't expect anything better from the professor. Okay.
That's right.
So mate, what is a brand? What is basically the definition of a brand?
Well, as someone who's built a career in part working on brand development, I've never actually looked it up once in the dictionary or Googled it. So I guess I know and I don't know. But from my experience, it's basically, at its most global, a brand is every touch point a consumer or person has with an organization. And, if you're saying one thing through your advertising, but your customer service is absolute rubbish, then each touch point that is a negative experience is going to impact the overall brand value, the brand equity. But obviously, working in advertising, design, and marketing, there's only so much influence we can have over all of those, furthest touch points, or the interactions that the company and its employees have with people. So I guess where we come in is, looking at how we can make the organization as appealing as possible and as relatable as possible through the language of design and communication, and hopefully tell an appealing story that makes people want to consider, taking part or purchasing products or giving a second, thought to something that they might just, waltz by otherwise without taking any notice whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting because like every friend of mine who's quite widely recognized around the world in music or in film and television, as individuals, they also really understand their value, their brand, and what their value of their brand is. They can tell me straight away. And I remember one time sitting with Bam from Jackass, and he just knew exactly what his brand was and who he was speaking to, and his content revolved around that. And he had a couple of properties. But, do you ever work with individuals as well as organizations, or is it primarily with larger organizations?
Oh, it's really everything from startups and individuals who need something for a small business, right through to working with global organizations where it could be repositioning them, and dealing with the meta language that expresses their point of difference in the market. So it's really across the board, but and more so when I consult to other larger agencies who have global accounts, it's more likely to be on that scale. And certainly working with my own direct clients, sometimes they're large organizations, but often they might be small startups, and they're lean and mean, and we need to be efficient and generate results that give them cut through in obviously what's a massively cluttered marketplace.
So where do you start, Adrian? Let's say that someone comes to you. Like, what's the first process? Do you have a standard process, or is it basically do you just work? Do you just change depending on who you're working with?
It depends on who I'm working with, but generally speaking, and often, someone might come with me and they're starting a business, and they will want to have a logo. And I've got a graphic design background as well, and design brand identities, there's always a few projects running simultaneously on that front. But the first question I always have is, do you have a brand positioning? And a
What
lot
does
of the
that
time
mean,
they
mate?
won't even, yeah, they
What?
won't even know what that means.
Right.
But a lot of people understand the idea of corporate mission statements, and they're normally, in my experience, inward facing, mealy mouthed, you know, expressions of a corporate um, vision or aim, which are really dense and complex, and you know they all sound remarkably similar, and they're
Yeah.
really confusing.
Yeah.
It's the polar opposite of what a brand positioning should be,
You're very
which is
ambiguous and, fluffy words and
absolutely they're filled with kind of you know well-intentioned virtue signaling fluff,
mm,
and it's really hard to actually make head or tail of them.
tontine
Whereas
pillows.
a exactly. Whereas a brand positioning is kind of, I guess, consumer facing normally. It could be, a business that's servicing another business, but it's outward facing, and it has to be the most crisp and potent. Some people call them taglines. You know, there's a few different ways of talking about them, but it's that crisp statement that sums up the entire purpose of the organization. Some of the most famous ones are obviously Nike "Just Do It," which is so strong that it hasn't changed in decades, and it probably will never need to change. Apple had "Think Different," and these. I like to think of these lines as corporate poetry.
Right.
Um, and it's because you're using like I write a lot of headlines for advertising as well, and advertising campaigns tend to be more transient, whereas a positioning line is anchoring the intention of a brand for it might be a 5 or 10 year timeline or longer, but it's not something which changes with great frequency. So it's important that they get it right, and within a few words you sum up the whole I guess, ethos of a business or a venture. And in that, you create a springboard, if you do it right, which can influence every aspect of the marketing from there on in, from the advertising, which can, be inspired by that, to the look and feel of the brand identity itself. Um, it's basically at the heart of a great piece of storytelling.
And then
So,
with that, so you look at, say, Nike "Just Do It," or
mm,
what do we say, Apple "Think Different." It seems to
mm,
me the ones that are really successful are really simple in their, they don't go into these long descriptive things. It's sort of boiled back down to, um, it's about, at least those two are action driven, right? It's like "Just Do It,"
mm.
"Think Different." It's about doing something and the brand interacting with an action. Is that,
Yes.
is that something that you think is part of the thought process, or is that just by accident? Do you think that those two that we picked resonate like that?
It's active language, it's positive, but I think it's on a case by case basis, depending on what the business does. And sometimes it could be a humorous line, sometimes it could be a really earnest line. But at the end of the day, if someone wants to build a brand, that's usually where I start. The only place that you can start before that is if they haven't got a name, or if they've got a terrible name which needs reworking. That's probably your most critical asset, because that's the thing which is going to be said a squillion times.
Yeah.
So if there's the opportunity to rename or name a business anew, that's a incredibly powerful place to start. But often businesses already are existing and there's equity in the name, and it's a big deal to change it mid flow. But something that often can be developed if it's not existing already is a brand positioning. And it and it's funny as well, like a lot of agencies are very into selling clients brand workshops. And I've sat through many brand workshops which have made me want to cry. I've been so bored and irritated by them.
But did you
um,
cry? Did you cry?
I didn't cry. I held it in. I
Right.
held in a muffled
That's
scream.
the professionalism
um,
in you.
Exactly. So I held in the muffled scream, and the reason there was a muffled scream is because it tends to, go in, I suppose, circles, and tends to, the brand workshops often tend to be incredibly esoteric. Um, and personally, when I'm working with clients, I just like to have a straight up conversation where we're getting to the heart of things really quickly, just in a conversation like we're having, and finding out what's important. And I think a lot of it then comes down to the quality of the individual who's developing the ideas, being able to draw out what's needed, being able to discern what's important, what the problem is, what they're wanting to solve, and then being able to, I guess, go into the lab, as it were, and add all of the necessary elements to the conical flasks and test tubes, and give it
See what the
a
mix comes up like.
exactly, give it a bit of time over the Bunsen burner and see what spills over. But hopefully that's for me that's far more focused than just very sort of I guess broad-based navel gazing,
Mm.
which can sort of it sort of feels like a very long-winded
Well,
way to get to the essence of something.
it's fun. Like I remember when I invented Linus back in many years ago, and we
Mm,
workshopped just the internal team around a name for the business, and it was hard because we've developed a basically I invented a renderless video technology that allows artificial intelligence to build shows on the
mm,
fly without going to an edit suite. And so, how do you describe that? And so, basically, we went on a process of trying to look for through basically lateral thinking and critical thinking. We've identified that something in nature that does what we did with video, which was a bumblebee, and a bumblebee goes out of a hive to a plant, pulls out pollen, brings it back, and turns that into honey. So there's a
mm.
metamorphosis process. So then we looked at the name of the bumblebee, which was Apis Linnaeus. And Apis Linnaeus was named
Oh
after the
wow.
godfather of metadata, Albertus Linnaeus. And so that's where the sort of name came from. But what it allowed was, it allowed when we brought the name to market to actually tell the story behind it, which created
Mm,
this engagement to tell the people in a normal language actually what the product does through the lens of a bumblebee. So it became this really powerful positioning statement to explain a very technical technology through the lens of a
mm,
bumblebee, which everyone understood. And it always resonated with me that the importance of a brand, whether you're a person, a rock star, whether you're Marilyn Manson who's got a specific image talking, or Slipknot to a certain audience, or whether you're a tech company who's got this crazy brand new tech, you need to root it in some sort of language that translates to an audience. And look, I know from myself, in whether I'm doing Rosonics with Ahmed or some of the other companies, so much work goes into understanding how to what name, as you mentioned, the company is, and how you can hang off that, and what the messaging that comes out of that. So, I've seen some of the things that you do, and it's amazing. But
thank you.
I'm trying to wrestle down to the ground to try and explain to people it's like how important that is. A lot of people can go on and do 20 activities and build products and do all this, but it seems to me if you don't have that right, you're doing a lot of work, which could result in a lot of hard work that's being wasted. Would you sort of agree with that, or?
I think that almost any business that works can be explained in really simple terms. Whether you build widgets or whatever it is, and I say that from the perspective of sometimes you get someone coming to you with a business that they want a brand developed for, and the fundamental thinking is so confused. They might be passionate and they want to create something, but you can just tell from the outset this thing is going to tank regardless of what you do and bring to it from a creative point of view, because the business fundamentals are so sort of, you know, I guess unstable.
Sure.
And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and and yeah, and like there's only so much that we can sort of do to overcome, you know, fundamental failings at that level. So yeah, but
But to do it at the
assuming all
wrong
those
stage,
things.
like if you just go, oh look, we'll do that brand later, and let's go because we got all this other stuff to do that's important, and we'll get all that stuff to later.
Mm,
The time and energy of rebranding something and not doing it up front is sort of. I think you miss out on the opportunity to tell a story in a much
Yeah,
better
absolutely.
way. I think having someone external like yourself who's a professional at it gives you a non-emotional viewpoint, which is super important in coming to
Mm,
looking at the business through a fresh lens. Because I know you can get so caught up in what you're doing that you want to shape it in a certain way, which is fine. But if you're not testing it with someone else who's a professional at that, understanding how a language translates. But again, I think I've worked and mentored so many businesses that have got to change once they're scaling up or once they've done something, and it's so hard to reverse a brand
mm.
once you've actually started down that journey. Would you sort of agree with that, or?
Well, yeah, like certainly as well. Like there are just plain huge economic costs if you've got a company that has to, again, midstream because it's not been well devised in the first place. They suddenly have to go through the cost of not only developing the new brand identity and the spend associated with telling that story anew. It could be like fleets of cars and vehicles and just all sorts of things which need to be you know redone
Recalibrated,
with
yeah.
the new branding. And of course, at the same time, there are successful businesses that realize and recognize that along the way they're going to need to rebrand and refresh their message and their look to reflect the world as it is today, rather than maybe what was working for them 10 years ago. And one thing that's really interesting, we think of, I guess, enduring brands from Coca-Cola to Volkswagen to all these, iconic brands, and we tend to think of them as having like, that's the logo. But if you actually look at the history of them, they've rebranded probably
A
in
number of
in
times.
some form once every 10 years. They're usually very, subtle,
Yeah.
but over time you can see there's definite shifts and yeah, and part of that is making their brand relevant to the world that they're operating in at that point in time, and by not doing that, you're obviously, it looks like a house that hasn't been lived in.
Well,
So,
talking about that, so we're talking about organizations. Let's talk about people for a moment.
mm,
I'm My corporate identity and my corporate work is in coaching around innovation disruption.
mm,
I come from an entrepreneurial background. I've been on boards. I've exited businesses. I've got patents, all that sort of stuff. And sort of I look like a heavy metal guy, but it's sort of, if you can't get past this image, obviously, it's going to be hard for you to understand how to look at transformation because it's that
mm,
lens. So it's my brand is actually part of the message. And but it's still true to who I am as a musician and a creative. And I find that with yourself too. You've got this sort of professor look. There's your shots are in the lab, and you're experimenting and you're putting things together and you're testing things and looking for reactions. You know, both of us have got brands, and I think it's. I don't see a lot of people really working in the corporate world on their own brand identity. Is that because I'm just not looking, or is that sort of is that something that's it's just not done because it's about the organization, not the people? What's your thoughts on that?
well, I think that generally speaking, we're in the business of, whether it's innovation, creativity, um, looking at the world through that lens and bringing value through that lens. Whereas, someone who might be in a professional services business or whatever it is, if you're the guy making widgets in the factory, then that's what you're doing. So
Yeah,
your focus is probably not going to be on, as your primary concern, how can I sum this up in a more creative way? But of course, like, at the business level, you need your product, but you also need to be able to market it. So you need a way of connecting, with consumers or with whoever's, going to be using your product. And particularly if, widget factory A is sitting next door to widget factory B, how are they going to distinguish their products?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's exactly what branding is. It's particularly when you've got, a market with similar products, how do you find a voice that distinguishes yours? Your ideal, I guess, unicorn scenario might be when you have a product where there's nothing else like it, and you really can go out and tell a unique story. Um, and that's an incredibly valuable and rare position to be in. The rest of the time, you're often dealing with products and things which, there's not such a lot distinguishing one from the other. So it comes down to obviously price points really important if you're talking about particularly FMCG products in the supermarket. Price points important, but also the story that you tell through the packaging design cues and things like that, and the branding can be the difference between you feeling engaged by a product and interested in what they've got to say in the context of that product versus another thing which you might feel
Yeah.
less inspired to reach out for.
Well, I think
So,
on that too, like one thing I've learned from bringing innovations to market and building companies and X, Y, and Z is that I believe there's a couple of super overlooked important factors in being either an inventor or a founder, or even bringing the business to market, and that is learning the art of storytelling. Being able to tell a story that resonates at its most common level with some sort of level of aspirational value. And so obviously I've spent a lot of my life being an entertainer, performer, and as a performer, and you know this through music, you actually are always thinking about how this connects with an audience, how you write a song how does this resonate with someone? And so it's part of your makeup and DNA. And, one of the things I learned from building tech companies is that without the art of storytelling, you can't raise investment. You can't build a team. You can't, it's very hard for you to get traction in the marketplace and talk to someone about the value statements that you're creating if you can't tell this through a lens that's aspirational, that's storytelling like, and it used to amaze me. I'd go to these presentations and someone would stand up and start reading off PowerPoint. And, it would just be so boring. And for someone like me as an artist and entertainer and entrepreneur, I try to use to maximize that. And I think that brand in itself is more than just Nike, just do it. It's the story that lies around it that brings to life why just do it matters. And the art of storytelling around a simple thing like just do it, it can transform its identity into different markets of the world, into different places from, whether it's being used in weightlifting or sprinting or, there's so many different applications of that. Is that part of the thought process that you use when you're actually going back to boiling it down to actually coming up with a brand? Is part of that storytelling important in how you're thinking about that?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental because I guess part of the advantage that I bring to the work that I'm doing and the way that I'm doing it is I've got such a broad, like yourself, a very broad background that covers off, graphic design. I originally trained as an interior designer working in the architecture world.
Right.
Not that I do much related to that anymore, but graphic design, advertising, copywriting, all these things. So when it comes time to really work on anything, but in this case, if we're talking about a brand positioning, I've automatically got the frame of reference of all the different ways that it can and might be used. So
Right.
it's a very unusual synthesis to be able to think of these things simultaneously and think like, oh, that combination of words, that could be the basis, flipped like this, that could be the basis of a brand campaign that could work with this. And with those words, that implies this visual hook. And all these things happen simultaneously that might kind of be teased out over a far longer timeline if you had a traditional agency team working on it,
Yeah.
where one person is responsible for the words, another for the visual ideas, and another person yet again to bring it together as designed artwork. And in between that, you've got account people and the suits, and there's multiple instances where you've got the possibility of communication breaking down.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just really fortunate that it all can happen in the midst of my own head.
Well, it's that power of the disparate sort of experiences that allows you to see that, I suppose. It's that lens, sort of the ability through those different experiences, which, for a
And I
long
was going
time,
to,
I just think that I think that's such an overlooked thing as well, being able to have being able to synthesize different experiences in life and put that
Yeah.
together. And it helps you with your pattern recognition, helps with non-linear decision making. There's a whole heap of sort of great values that come from that, especially from a creative standpoint, such
Yeah.
as the
And
stuff
I was
you
going
do.
to say, from a creative standpoint, one of the things that was really apparent to me when I was, working in agency land when I was, a few years younger, um, was there was a great obsession with awards and a great obsession with pouring through all of the award books to see the award winning work. And while that was inspiring and amazing work to be seen, it could quite easily become a self-referential, echo chamber. And
Yeah,
I think the key to great original creativity with cut through is when you live life richly and draw on, as many different points of reference as possible, and you experience different things that you can then bring to the work. And it doesn't mean that you're doing those things and thinking, I'm going to bring that to the work. It just means you've got this wealth at your disposal of stimulus, or stimuli that you can draw on at any moment. And you don't know what it is you're going to draw on, but it's there. And it can't be gamed, it can't be AI'd. Um, it's your repository of memory, and you know
it's that collective
whether it's
experience. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And I was going to say, I mean, some of the people who are watching this might be curious that I'm sitting in a music studio, but that's the studio where I do also my design work. But probably my capacity as a copywriter has been infinitely enhanced by being a songwriter first, because once you know, as I'm sure you'd recognize as well, once you can create rhythm and flow with words over a grid of time, writing a piece of prose, a piece of copy for an ad is basically a piece of piss by comparison.
yeah.
It's so easy when you're freed from having to,
Especially with the
choose.
advent of rap, you can rap anything, right?
Well, possibly. There's a lot of art in that too, but I think it's you know,
Oh, I was actually being sarcastic, but
of course, of course. Um, but yeah, like it's when you're having to search for just the right word to express just the right sentiment, um, in time and against rhythm and melody and so forth. Writing without those constraints is a lot easier. But
yeah,
it's also like been an incredible training ground, or boot camp for what it takes to then, write incredibly impactful headlines, or incredibly impactful positioning lines.
yeah. Well, look, so let's now switch gears for a sec. So
Hmm.
let's pretend I'm Joe Public, and I have no idea where to start, and I can't get in contact with you because you're in the Bahamas in your gold-plated jet from all the money you've made from working with all these massive companies. And so where do I start? So where do I start thinking about um, how do I start elevating and just where do I start looking? Like where do I get some inspiration to start thinking about how I develop a brand if I don't have access to you?
Um, well, I guess it depends on whether the person who represents Joe Public is someone who wants to be the creative, and developing brands for other people, or
Well,
whether
okay,
it's
let me rephrase that. Let's say I'm a
yep.
person.
Hmm.
I'm not someone working in an organization. Let's say I'm a person and
Hmm.
I want people to recognize me and the things I'm doing. Right? So I don't have an organization behind me. Let's make it harder. Um, what are the things I could do as a person to start thinking about, well, how do I figure out what my identity is, and how do I know that might work? What are some of the exercises or some of the places that someone could start looking to get inspiration?
Well, I think it's just about, in the first instance, um, we're at our strongest when we've got, in terms of our identity, when we've got great clarity about what we're doing, why we're doing it. And I think when you can get that clarity, you're going to be in a greater position to create something around you which means something. Um,
Okay,
And
right there, that's a great. Let's just stop there for a second, because when I'm mentoring, especially actually not even startups, large companies, like one of the things I say is, don't tell me what you do, because everyone wants to tell me what they do. Don't tell me what you do, and they're like, but I go, stop, don't tell me what you do. Tell me the value you create. And they're like, oh, well, what we do is we get PDFs and we encrypt them. Stop. That's what you do. Tell me what value you create. And I work through this exercise because if you're talking value, typically you have to think about the person you're providing value for. And so because you have to understand what value is. Because if you don't and you say it's value to you, then I go, okay, who is your audience? And how do you know that value statement resonates to them? So from what I'm hearing, what you're saying, tell me if I'm wrong here, is once you've sort of worked that out, that's your starting point to working out what your brand might be. Because is that right or wrong from what you're saying?
Generally speaking, that sounds like it's heading in the right direction. I think that interestingly, like often where you get people who will create breakthrough brands, they'll have interests in disparate areas, and they might be an expert in each of those areas, and they bring those areas together, not because they're being shrewd or intentionally clever. It's just they're the things they're interested in,
Right.
and so they actually find themselves in a unique position of creating something new that brings those worlds together. And in doing that, they bringing some of their authenticity to the table, and it's resonating with other people who kind of go, oh wow, I'm into A and B as well.
Right.
Why hasn't anyone else thought of that? And often that's the basis of building a brand or a product which has an audience and a value. And so yeah, like I think it's if the thing you're into is, I don't know, I
Chocolate
love
covered
guitars.
surfboards.
Yeah, it could be that. I was going to say I love guitars. Like maybe
Okay.
one day I'll find a way of maybe one day I'll have a guitar shop. Who knows?
Yeah.
Just don't tell my wife I said that.
No. Yeah.
But I don't know. Like, and I'm not sure how
Yeah.
I'd be
Well,
able to bring that together with other things that I love. But I think like when you try the flip side of that is when you try to impose things on yourself which aren't true to who you are, you set yourself up for a life of misery.
Yeah.
So I was working earlier in my career, before I moved into advertising, I was working with a group who are now Deloitte Digital in the multimedia space. And there was basically one side of the building was the designers and the other side of the building was the programmers. And it felt like there was a great pressure to learn how to program.
Right.
And, I did a few, HTML classes and, was learning some basics of coding in Macromedia Director and the early, I guess, iterations of Flash
Yeah.
and all of that. And it just felt like banging my head against a brick wall. And I sort of at that time realized, I can, persist with this stuff. And the breakthrough, I guess, observation was I'll only ever be average at that, or average at that sort of stuff. There are people around me who are brilliant at it. Why do I want to compete with those who are, naturally gifted at this stuff?
Yeah.
When I am, struggling with it? The thing that I recognized that I, had in spades that some of them may not have had was the big kind of creative idea style of thinking, which is obviously really well suited to advertising, which is what I then gravitated towards.
Yeah, sure.
And the takeaway from that is, go with the grain because it's always going to be so much more pleasurable and easy.
Too, Adrian, the companies I've sort of worked with and founded and stuff like that, part of the learning lessons I've had with working, and hopefully you can help shape this because I sort of don't know what I don't know either. I just know from what I've gone through when I've built brands and companies is it's been something about once we get close to, like with the Linnaeus is working out the name, is then making sure that the domain name is available. And if it's not available, phonetically looking at how you might be able to say it, but spell it in a different way, more of a phonetic thing. See if the domains, because if the domains aren't available and you've invested all this money into this idea, then it's like, is it really worth pursuing with it because you can't get the domain name? Some of the other
Mm.
things that we looked at were, okay, so you've got this concept around a name. Is there any other websites that are close that might be have some sort of relation to pornography or where someone might type it wrong? So there was all these factors that came into that we were being guided on when we were coming up with a name to go, well, it must pass this test and this test and this test before you actually settle on a brand. Do you have any sort of filters that you sort of, when you're coming up with something where you it has to pass a couple of tests before you go, this is a brand that you could bring it out into public?
Sure. Well, I was going to say that naming is literally the hardest activity that I get involved with. Not because it's fundamentally creatively hard, but because once you get to the point when you're testing availability, there are so many things that need to be taken um, into consideration. Um, and everything from domain name availability to business name availability to trademark availability to social media handles and profile names these days are something that also needs to be kept
Yeah,
in mind.
yeah,
I absolutely, it's in my terms and conditions. You know, I'm not an intellectual property solicitor. This is stuff before you can know that you're in the clear to proceed commercially. You need to get the due diligence done by an IP specialist
yeah,
who is the only one who's really going to be able to confirm that you're good to go. And it's
yeah,
also like you could be, if you're working on a product which is going to be sold in different territories, it needs to be available there. It's also different industry classes depending on what the product is. Yeah, like I've worked on, years ago I was doing some work at an agency coming up with a name of a bottled water, and we had a cracking name which we all loved, the client loved, went to the solicitors, and it was turned out it was a trademark parked by some company in Western Australia. It had never gone to market, never been used. It wasn't something that we could just Google and discover. It was only the kind of thing which was going to come to light getting,
proper search.
some proper, legal grade searches done. And obviously, it was good that we did that because obviously you don't want to go out there to market with something that's going to suddenly become a problem for your client and potentially also a problem for you. So
Mm.
it is a challenging thing, and of course, then you've also got like the meaning that different things might have in different languages. That if you're not from those cultures or don't speak those languages, it's almost impossible to
But
vet
still,
everything.
I can imagine though, like there's. I don't want to put anyone off here because I know there's a lot of gates to run through, especially if you're going to take a
Mm,
brand globally. But I think it's, at least from my point of view, it's still important to differentiate yourself, and whether that's from a look or a identity or a story. I think
absolutely.
personally, it adds, at least everything I do is built around some sort of level of brand. I haven't changed my brand for since the 80s, can't you tell?
Mm.
But the point is, whether I'm doing a corporate work or not, there's a story behind why I look this way. And once people get
Mm.
past that, it actually then, if they can get past that, it actually provides value because now I'm known as that guy, and that's why I look that way. It's just that initial, but the story is part of that. So what I would encourage is that people look to try and find some level of storytelling and differentiation and go on that journey and trying to think about, because to me that's how you actually start to create your own, well, as you said, it's the identity, right? And without it, it's sort
Mm.
of, you know
And the only thing I'd sort of caution there as well is if someone suddenly gets obsessed with, okay, I've got to build my personal brand, like any brand, if it's built on hot air, then and there's no substance beneath it, then it's ultimately at some point the ruse is going to come undone.
yeah,
So
got
it's like you've got to have something meaningful and substantial that you're going out to the world to share, which is going to bring value to people in some way.
Yeah.
And when you've got that, then you've got that story to tell,
So it's
which is
having
kind of like,
it's having the authenticity to yourself, but also
yeah.
in a way where that brand still creates value for others.
And I was going to say that could, maybe if you're starting out, that could sound kind of depressing. It's like, oh, how am I going to do that? And I was just going to say, like, from a creative evolution point of view, before I created Real Ads and Real Brands, I made stuff up for the hell of it. I had ideas that would just occur to me, and I'd want to mock them up and um, yeah, just test them out. And literally, this is quite a funny story. I probably get more work from the fake ads that I put out there as memes and just really taking the piss, using the skills that I have to make commentary on the world around us, the state of politics, um, and so forth. And I guess, being off the hook, not having an actual end client in those situations, I can say what the hell I like
Yeah.
within the bounds of the law.
Hmm.
But I can say what the hell I like, how I like it, and I can self-publish, put stuff out there, and sometimes things will, just vanish without a reaction, and other times they blow up and go hyper viral,
Yeah.
and suddenly you're part of the national conversation without
And I've seen
having
that happen with some of your work a number of times.
exactly. So yeah, and that's sort of I guess it's like a band that doesn't have a deal, rehearsing and playing, in their bedrooms, in the garage, and you're kind of refining what you do before you get your break.
Yeah.
And it's the sort of same thing, that I was doing. I've done it with music, but I've also done it with design and advertising, where I've practiced and refined that skill to the point where people are prepared to give you a go. I've also, along that trajectory, worked in agencies and had the amazing good fortune of working with some brilliant
Cool.
people who've been,
But
you
you're
know,
working on your when you're doing that stuff, that practice
mm,
stuff. You're not working within the bounds of a client's brand guidelines or structures.
absolutely,
This is purely your imagination being brought to life, which in essence is your true self, right? Your true creativity,
yeah.
because you're not bound up through the ethos or the laws or the structures or legals of another organization.
Well, when it's like I put a fake campaign on LinkedIn the other day with a made up business name, so it looked like a real ad, but it wasn't a real ad at all. um, and a real company in that space contacted me wanting to see if they could buy the campaign. So
Perfect.
yeah, exactly. So watch this space, but things can work in bizarre and unanticipated ways. It's about generating stuff,
Mm,
putting stuff out there, and not being deeply attached to an outcome.
yeah.
It's more about the volume, assuming quality as well. You don't want to put rubbish out there, but it's about not sort of fixating on every last sort of like or you know it's more about keeping going. Like that's literally my personal mantra is just keep going,
Mm.
keep generating stuff, keep putting stuff out there, and opportunities will snowball.
Well, on that, buddy, look, we're pretty much there now, time wise. But like, where can people find out about you? Like, how do people watching this episode? How do they find you?
Well, I suppose the best way to see
Besides
more
your
of the work,
billboards and your fake ads.
exactly. There are real ads too, but the
Yeah,
fake
yeah,
ads
yeah.
tend to get the most mileage. Um, so yeah,
Oh,
obviously my website www.adrianeltoncreative.com, and my contact details are there for
okay. Well,
anyone
we'll
who
put a
wants to
link
get
on
in
the
touch.
on the episode too. So if anyone needs to get to you, they can.
Fantastic,
Beautiful, well, mate.
awesome.
Well, it's been a true honor. It's been great. Thanks so much for your intel and getting us to all sort of meet the professor and figure
That's
out
it.
some of these secrets. And wish you all the best, and let's keep communicating as we always do behind the
Of course.
scenes. And
And
yeah,
I just wanted everyone to know that, obviously part of my brand as the brand professor, as it were, like, is wearing this outfit, and I wear it everywhere, in the shower, to bed.
nice.
I'm never not wearing it. Of course
So where do you get
of
it dry
course,
cleaned?
I hardly ever wear it. I'm just wearing it for the sake of brand consistency, and
So you
for
really
the hell
you
of it.
really live and breathe in your brand, right?
Exactly.
Right.
It's awkward for the kids when I pick them up from school. It's like, what, is your dad an industrial chemist?
So
No,
do you
he's
have a
just
do you have
some
a sponsorship
crazy
from
guy.
Omo?
Yeah, exactly. They send me clipboards so I
Nice,
can,
mate. Nice.
yeah,
All right, buddy.
look the
Well,
part.
great catching up with you. Thanks so much for everything, and yeah,
Pleasure.
we'll keep on the airwaves.
Absolutely. See you later. Thanks for that, Finn.
See you, buddy. Take care. Have a great
Cheers.
one.
Bye bye.